Hello friends, my name is Ihor Havryshchak. This is the traditional YouTube platform of Channel 24. We are in a live broadcast, so I ask you to be active, like, subscribe, write your questions, constructive, adequate, we will bring them into our conversation. I welcome our guest, this is Doctor of Economics Igor Lipsits. Igor Vladimirovich, hello. Hello. On the 13th of September 2024, the Board of Directors of the Bank of Russia decided to raise the key rate to 19% per annum. Also, Russians got into record debts on credit cards in 2.5 years, and also Russian companies began to have problems with paying debts in yuan. Mr. Vladimirovich, I will ask you to explain all this, so that we all understand where everything is heading. Let's start with the discount rate. What does it mean by 19%? As far as I understand and as far as I remember, this is not the first time that the Bank of Russia has raised the discount rate. Yes, it has grown quite a lot, and we see hints from the leadership of the central bank that they will continue to raise 9% to 20%, and, as far as we remember, the Russian stock market already sees and expects this. But the situation is clear that inflation is growing, it is not possible to suppress it. And the central bank pretends to be active in the fight against inflation. Each department, each minister must depict great activity, great zeal in solving their specific problems. But the central bank is responsible for suppressing inflation, for stabilizing the ruble. He pretends that he is fighting inflation, so he raises the rate. But in fact, it's all quite funny. If you also take into account that the first draft of the budget for the next year has already appeared, and one of the main sources of income there is an increase in VAT. And this is achieved only at the expense of rising prices. Prices are rising, and the amount of VAT paid by all consumers is increasing accordingly. Therefore, it turns out that if the central bank, by raising the rate, suppresses inflation, then it will undermine the execution of the budget that the Ministry of Finance has now prepared. Well, this is the picture. But inflation is rising, and the central bank is feigning great concern about this and is allegedly trying to suppress it. And what will it turn out to be? How will the population of Russia feel this? It feels it differently, depending on which population a person belongs to. If a person belongs to the rich population, there are about 15% of them in Russia, but at best 20%, then this is good for him. He can put money in the bank on deposit at a higher interest rate and, accordingly, earn a little extra money on the high profitability of his deposit. Now deposits are accepted at more than 20% per annum. Some banks offer pensioners 25%, and so on. If a rich person wins it, and if he is a poor man, he always loses, because if he takes a loan to buy some commodity that he needs, for which he does not have money right away, then he will naturally pay a higher fee for the loan, and many loans and many things bought on credit simply become unavailable. By the way, one of the topics that I have mentioned, yes, is that Russians have got into record debts on credit cards in 2.5 years. Where will it go, Igor Vladimirovich? And sir, where can you get money then, if, as I understand it, if you do not work in the military-industrial complex, you do not have much money? Russians are now in a state of feverish buying activity. They understand that it is worse ahead, there is a long trouble ahead. After all, the war has been going on for 3 years, and although the Russians pretend that they don't care about it at all, it is not significant in any way and does not spoil their lives. But, of course, people understand that if a country gets into a war for 3 years, then over time it will get worse and worse, and they are trying to have time to buy. Therefore, they have a certain consumer excitement. Well, counting on the fact that inflation will gradually lead to an increase in incomes, and old debts will depreciate. Hope for this. The hope, perhaps, is that everything will collapse altogether, and there will be no need to repay debts. Funny as it may seem, people develop such ideas in their heads. Well, people live in a simple way, they have accumulated debts, and in order to cover these debts, they take new debts and thereby cover the old ones. Therefore, in Russia, there are debts to banks, and people still run and buy or borrow something from microcredit organizations, and at the expense of money from microcredit organizations, they pay off debts to banks. Well, that's the story. Therefore, we have regions of Russia where the ratio of payments required per month to earnings ranges from 80 to 110%. That is, a person must pay 10% more per month than he earns money at all. Well, That's how they live. But, as I understand it, that's why they take loans, and how does this cycle end? With some kind of criminal case. It's normal for someone who is more cunning to be bankrupt, but how can I tell you? Russians have now learned to do cunning things, but these are those who are very financially literate and smart. They put their earnings on a deposit in the bank, but they are rich, which means they receive a large interest. At the same time, several credit cards are opened, which have a so-called grace period, that is, a grace period when you do not pay interest. Due to these cards, they buy goods, return money in conditions of good earnings quickly so as not to pay interest. And, accordingly, due to this, they get the opportunity to spend without paying interest, and at the same time, they put the money that they had on deposits and earn. But these are the rich, and the poor hope that they will be able to somehow get out of it, but it ends in bankruptcy. In Russia, there is a huge flow of personal bankruptcies, not companies, but personal ones, and a whole group of legal specialists has appeared who hang announcements on Moscow and other streets that they will quickly go bankrupt. Contact us, we will help what problems there are. This is also happening, but a person who has gone through bankruptcy is limited in his rights, he has control over his earnings, he can do little, he cannot take loans for 3 years, and so on. But people go for it, because they understand that they need to have time to buy now. While there are some goods, while there is some money, while they still give loans, it will get worse in the future. It is as if people are now trying to create such a property reserve for the future. Difficult times are ahead, you have to pay them. Mr. Lavrov, you have already mentioned the budget that I understand already exists for 2025. Yes, it will either be voted on, or it will still have to. But the bottom line is that 40% of this budget is for the needs of the war in Ukraine. How much will this affect Russia and how will it affect Russia? As I have already said, if you do not work at the factory, if you do not manufacture some shells or some needs for the front, then you have no money. Look, Russia is now splitting into two different groups of people, who live in completely different ways, who have completely different perspectives. Those who are chained to the war, who have attached themselves to the war, who have grown attached to the war, they are doing well. They are the so-called beneficiaries of the war, or, as they are called in scientific language, the beneficiaries of war. They make money. I think that this year in Russia the number of billionaires who make good money on the war will grow, and the number of rich people who work in this complex will grow. I don't necessarily mean only my own workers, but also all the managers of these military factories, everyone from small or medium-sized businesses who supply something for the war. They earn well, they are happy, and they want this war to go on forever. And those who do not work for the defense industry, do not supply something to the army, their situation is bad, especially among pensioners. Russian pensioners seem to have begun to come to some kind of poverty, more or less terrible. They began to live a little better. There was even a moment when they ceased to be the poorest group of the population of Russia. This group became families with small children. And now the situation is very bad again, that wages have grown, prices have risen under wages, but pensions have not grown. There are 140 million people in Russia, about 42 million people are pensioners. Pensions are growing very slightly, pensions are small. Well, I always receive letters from pensioners. Someone has 13,300, someone has 14,700, well, someone has a little more than 15,200, well, these are tiny pensions, they are indexed by 5 to 7% per year, and consumer prices in Russia are now rising. In 1 month you buy medicine, but you sit in the horn, in another you fatten up a little, but you sit without medicine, trying to survive somehow. Well, that's the picture. So the majority of the population of Russia, they will suffer, their real standard of living will fall, because no one will raise their salaries anymore. This period of wage increases is already over in Russia, there are no reserves, but those who have sucked into the war will live better. Igor Vladimirovich, large Russian businesses have faced problems with repaying debts in Chinese yuan due to the shortage of yuan in the Russian market. How can this be explained and why the shortage of these yuan, and what does it mean that the Russian company has problems with paying debts in yuan? Well, there is a complicated story. It is associated with the fact that China is very carefully distancing itself from Russia and does not really want to help it with all sorts of monetary transactions. Everyone is afraid that China's own banks will be sanctioned, so very difficult situations have arisen with the receipt of yuan in Russia and even sending yuan to China. China, for example, does not really accept yuan, which comes from Russia. That is, if you bought yuan on the Moscow currency exchange, and try to pay with them for goods from a Chinese supplier, then you cannot send this money to China. China does not accept it. Although this is Chinese yuan, well, such an incredible division has arisen, but I did not come up with it. Maybe it is easy for me to check. There was a gradation of the purity of the yuan, dirty yuan and clean. For Chinese goods, the Chinese supplier can be paid in pure yuan. Pure yuan is the one that you manage to buy in some way or get in China, and then you can pay with it. If you bought yuan on the Moscow Stock Exchange, then you cannot pay with them, you cannot repay the debt, and you have a situation. You receive the goods, but you are in debt. Accordingly, no one will send you the next batch of goods, because you have not repaid the debt on the previous batch. And you have them too, but they are not full-fledged, no one accepts them. Therefore, Russian companies, now having found themselves in this situation for their position, they are implementing an incredible scheme of nightmare, but it is real. That is, these companies are trying to somehow buy gold in third countries, sell this gold to someone in Singapore, and get pure yuan in Singapore for this gold. These pure yuan from Singapore are transferred to the bank account of their supplier, but since there is no normal bank settlement between Singapore and China, special couriers are hired who fly to Singapore, take payment documents for the transfer of yuan and carry the documents confirming that the payment has been made to China, as they say. Well, that's the picture. Well, this is just evidence that China, it is very carefully distancing, it is not very eager to help Russia, it is respecting its interests, and its interests are precisely in not actively helping Russia. By the way, in the context of China, here are China and India, these are the main buyers of oil from Russia. And over the past 30 days, a month, India has reduced purchases by 20%, but China has bought a little more than usual. Why is this happening, Igor Vladimirovich? And here is the fall in oil prices, they are now rising, but how much can this affect Russia? And I, of course, am interested in Russia's war in Ukraine, because the only, as I understand it, income for Russia is oil and dollars from this black gold. Look, moreover, it is not only India that has cut back there. Today we received information that Turkey has halved its oil purchases from Russia. The reason, I think, is that Russia has managed to somewhat reduce the discount in legal terms in relation to the brand, it has become smaller. Well, buyers began to look for other alternatives, since oil in the world in general can now be found and there are different suppliers who are ready to supply oil. And in general, in any quantity, and these are not only OPEC countries, there are many other countries that are ready to sell oil. We have already seen the situation last year, when India suddenly began to reduce purchases and then began to buy oil quite actively, for example, from the United States. Because the price was fine, the calculations were simpler, the delivery was better, so, in general, the Indians started. You see, there is another problem with India. This means that very old ships are being brought to India, the so-called shadow fleet of Russia. And these are dangerous ships, they are very old, worn out, usually these are ships, as far as we know, that are 30 years old. And tankers, it is believed, can be operated more or less safely until the age of 16, and then they become the most accident-prone. And the Indians began not to let these ships into the ports, because they are old, dangerous, there will be an accident, the port will die, right? They began not to let them in, so the ships, therefore, ended up in the roadstead, they tried to reload oil from the roadstead, it is all very difficult and inconvenient. The Americans send in new tankers, so for India this is a more problem-free delivery. So, in general, we see that even India is somehow looking for alternatives, and if there is a reduction in prices, then it is possible that they will find cheaper, more convenient suppliers in other countries. There are many such players in the market. The same Iran, by the way, always offers Indians oil at a price lower than the Russian one, gives a discount. So Iran is, you know, a specific friend of Russia, which at any moment wants to bite off your piece and seize a piece of the Indian market instead of you. So I think that, most likely, the Indians have found some Iranian supplies, and, accordingly, Russia is losing part of the Indian market. Well, China, probably, yes, buys, because it needs the opportunity to trade somehow. The Chinese position is strange. On the one hand, the Chinese economy is interested in the supply of goods to Russia in order to somehow load the generally unstable Chinese economy, and on the other hand, they are afraid that their banks will fall under sanctions. Therefore, there is some kind of maneuvering all the time, and it changes from month to month. Do I understand correctly, Igor Vladimirovich, if the United States of America wanted to, with heavy sanctions, they could reduce oil sales to China? You know, it's not even about sanctions, it's about the need to help produce more and sell more oil. And, by the way, this is already beginning to happen. I have been following a very interesting story for a long time. There is a great oil power, Canada, which can produce a lot, but they had problems. I remember that even under Bush, the pipeline that went from Canada to the United States and through the Gulf of Mexico was blocked. Then the oil went up in tankers. The Americans blocked it, there were some conflicts, and as a result, Canada was unable to significantly increase oil supplies. But now I have received a letter from Canada that they have completed the construction of a pipeline to the shores of British Columbia and will now send it by tankers to the world, not through the United States, but directly from their shores. That is, they will be able to increase more. That is, there are quite a few countries that could supply more, and the United States, by the way, could supply more oil. But a rather serious company related to secondary energy is lobbying against this, because if oil becomes cheaper, then the American voter rejoices, and those who have invested in secondary energy technologies lose. These technologies are becoming less in demand. Well, the world is difficult to arrange, so it is clear that in the United States there is a kind of struggle between factions. Someone wants to produce more oil, someone is trying to put spokes in the wheels of the oil industry in order to better sell renewable technologies. Therefore, not everything is simple there, but except, I repeat, the United States, there are many countries that can build up. If, for example, the United States somehow comes to an agreement with Venezuela, then it is possible that on the horizon of several years, the birth from Venezuela is significant. Then prices will begin to fall. Actually, the forecast for next year is a drop in prices. There, the largest oil trader Gunvard gave a forecast for the next year 60. This is already a very big misfortune for Russia, a very serious catastrophe, and then very big financial difficulties arise, which it is not clear how Russia will extinguish. Do I understand correctly, Igor Vladimirovich, that this is just that price ceiling of $60 and plus this is an inert thing? The result of the fact that we will not feel a very low oil price. Now I mean, yes, the consequences for Russia. $60 per barrel is Brent, which means that for Russia it will be $55, even lower, because there is still a discount. And the Russian budget, for example, this year, was calculated for the price of oil by about 70. Then, in order to make ends meet, Russia will have to devalue the ruble very much, because there is no other way to get money. And this is again an acceleration of inflation, this is again a violation of social stability, because people are beginning to worry very much about this. For Russians, the depreciated ruble is the main indicator of whether things are going well in the country or not. Therefore, the government is afraid to greatly devalue, but it will have to. Next year Russia has no other way, and the Russians are waiting for a revolution. This means that all imports will rise in price very much. They will become practically available only to the richest, and the Russians will be left with only domestically produced goods that have also risen in price. Recently, there were quite interesting statistics published on the Russian clothing market, where it turned out that Russia itself covers only 30% of the required clothing production, and even then 80% of these 30% are sewn in the same China, but under Russian brands. Therefore, without imports, and if they rise in price, it will not even be possible to sell them, because no one will be able to buy. It's just that Russian stores will begin to be allowed. Russians do not believe in this yet. It seems to them that it will always be full, but this is all such an illusion. I understand that there is no one to make clothes, because everyone is working to replenish the military-industrial complex, or am I mistaken? There are a lot of reasons for this. Firstly, the first reason was that since the 90s, the Russian light industry has lost the market, the Chinese made it cheaper, and many enterprises simply disappeared, they simply closed, stopped working. There are not so many enterprises left that are somehow spinning, and then they tried to produce in Russia the same glory jeans, for example, the well-known Russian productivity, they tried to sew there in Russia for a long time, then, therefore, they also gave up and began to order in China. So, in general, the situation is difficult, It began before the war, and now it has worsened, because people are leaving. Huge labor shortage. The latest estimates show that Russia already has a labor shortage of 2 million people, and in the coming years it could reach 4 million. This deficit cannot be covered, it will only grow, especially since more and more people die in the war or return disabled. Therefore, it will be impossible to cover this deficit. The Russian economy is, of course, an interesting mechanism when the government talks about the rapid growth of the economy in a country where there is simply no one to work. Yes, Igor Vladimirovich, if we talk about oil, here is the search in Russia. Here I read the search for new large oil deposits in Russia, which could replace the reserves that are being retired due to production. Again, did not bring significant results. This is stated by the head of the Ministry of Natural Resources, Alexander Kozlov. He says that since the beginning of 2024, 5 fields have been developed, but their reserves are very small, literally for a month of sale. But other deposits, they are not available or there are no funds, how to work with them. Because I remember that the sanctions at the beginning of the full-scale invasion led to the fact that many corporations that have equipment know how to use it in order to start drilling, exploration and other things, they left Russia, but there are no specialists in Russia. Yes, it's true. In general, the situation with oil in Russia is not at all as favorable as people in Russia think. People write to me all the time, you always tell nasty things, and we have oil in the bowels, fall asleep, there will be enough forever. It's all nonsense. Physical reserves in the subsoil mean nothing. The only important thing is how much it will cost to extract oil from these fields, and how much oil you will take for it. If you spend more on oil production than you get for selling it, then you don't need oil, yes, and you won't produce it. This is not theory, this is practice. Russia's largest company, Rosneft, has just announced that they had huge plans for oil exploration on the shelf of the Laptev Sea. There is a potentially huge field of both oil and gas, and they postpone all this geological exploration, non-production for 5 years, because in the current situation there is no chance that it will somehow pay off. In Russia, there are cheap deposits, developed a long time ago. And all the new ones, they are expensive, then they are in more difficult conditions and Russia is not very good at geological exploration. You are right to say that there were quite a lot of so-called oil engineering companies in Russia, which are very good at searching for and finding oil. And now they're gone, and I think there is only one Berger shelf left. Well, in general, in Russia now the situation is quite sad. For example, last year there was a very large jump in the volume of drilling, but this drilling is not vertical, but horizontal. People do not always understand that you have a well, but it already produces less oil. You try to drill side holes and branches from it, so that maybe where else the oil came from. When there were foreigners, they showed quite well where to drill, and therefore drilling was not needed on a large scale. And now no one in Russia knows how to find this oil underground so well. According to geological exploration, there are echolocations, so they drill anywhere. There are a lot of buryots, it is all expensive, it all falls on the costs. It eats up profits, but oil is not always found. Therefore, as they say, the debit of wells does not grow, and in general, costs are growing, and this will mean that the Russian oil industry may come to a situation of unprofitability. No one believes in this, simply because people have forgotten the 90s, when the price of oil was low, and many Russian oil companies were unprofitable. Look at the history of the 90s and see. By the way, Igor Vladimirovich, there are many sectors of the economy that are unprofitable, but there is money, yes, or at least there was money, and first of all, it came from the sale of oil. But in the situation that you have just said, if oil is already in the red, then where to get money? This means that money will be taken away simply by the population, in all possible ways. This process has already begun. I wrote about it a year and a half ago in my lectures, told the people, had fun, thought that I would come up with some such dangerous and terrible stories. No, look at you. The flat taxation system has been abolished, a progressive scale of income is being introduced next year, and there is such a picture that wages are growing due to inflation, and you seem to have been less than the progression scale in terms of income, and now you have crawled into it, and suddenly you will have a progressive tax. And, of course, no one will index the lower limit for you, and you will pay more and more taxes as you earn more. So the progressive tax has already begun. Russians have just been cut off from the judicial protection of their rights by 10 times, immediately increasing the fees for filing lawsuits in court on any civil claim. Now it has become unavailable. Divorce fees have been raised, excise taxes on many goods are being increased. That is, Russians are now being very actively robbed, their money is being taken away from them, and the prospect in this sense is very scary. Russians do not believe in this, they believe that someone will take care of them, groom and cherish them, and will not rob them. God bless you. No one in the police is interested in all the income and the whole life of Russians. The money will be taken away by any possible means. Igor Vladimirovich, banks are also running out of funds for family mortgages. The limits on the family mortgage program in Russia, according to the Ministry of Finance, will be exhausted by November 2024. I understand correctly that those who took a husband, a wife and a small child, they want to live somewhere, they take a mortgage at good interest rates, and now these good interest rates will not be. Well, yes, they added a little, 100 billion rubles, but in general, this is a penny. And sir, of course, because what is a family mortgage? It is the state budget that pays extra for you to improve your housing conditions. Well, as if today the state does not prioritize improving the living conditions of the population, it is not a priority that weapons, war and, accordingly, occupation. They spend money on this, but there is no population, so they cancel preferential mortgages, which means that the limits on family mortgages remain quite strict. I repeat, they added, and now, apparently, it has been completed since November, we need to wait for next year, when new limits for next year will appear. Well, this is the picture. Once again, supporting the population requires money, and it is increasingly difficult for the state to find money for this. And next year we still do not see the entire budget. While there is only some first information about military spending, we cannot yet verify this, while the information is leaked. But on the 30th, the next draft budget should be published, clarified for 2025, there, probably, a lot of articles of peaceful life in Russia will be reduced. Someone expects a twofold reduction in spending on science and something else, but this is already happening everywhere. The life of Russians is becoming more and more gloomy. Now, for example, we are witnessing a picture when the Russian state has banned state-owned hospitals from buying imported medicines. They are expensive. It is necessary to save money by allowing, but now only Russian ones are treated. Russian medicines, well, what to hide them, they are quite bad, they have side effects, and sometimes the side effects are stronger than the therapeutic effect, but it is forbidden to buy imported medicines, that's it, and many people are already writing to me that they have been admitted to the hospital, and there are no medicines at all. You have to buy bandages yourself, disposable towel yourself, there is no liquid for medicines, for injections, for droppers. He brought it to his family, so he was treated. He did not bring it, he lay down and died. Well, this is the picture. Igor Vladimirovich, this is a bit of a question with sarcasm, but how can I have no money, if for signing a contract with the Ministry of Defense 2 million rubles, this is $20,000, who does not understand? And here is the latest information. Putin signed a decree that those who are already in the occupied territories, if they agree to take their families with him, they will also be paid up to 5 million rubles, which is about 20 to 20, this is about $50,000. How can there be no money for education? How can there be no money for other areas, if there are thousands of dollars here? Once again, those who have sucked into the war will have money, and this money will be taken at the expense of the rest of the population of Russia. That's all. Look, a pensioner receives a small pension, he goes to the store, buys food. There is VAT in food products. Food is becoming more expensive, the value of VAT in price is growing, and it turns out that the pensioner is giving an increasing part of his pension to those who will live in these new, former Ukrainian territories, and will set up a comfortable life for themselves there with their families. That is, some are taken away, others are given. This is the picture. Fuel export bans. Why is that? Why is there a lot of oil? We recycle a lot. Why permanent bans? And why should there be a shortage of gasoline and fuel in Russia? Well, look, let's start with a simple one. Russia is waging a difficult war. So, accordingly, a huge consumer has appeared, which did not exist before. That is, there was a certain balance of production and consumption of gasoline and dispropellants, which means that no one foresaw that there would be such huge expenditures on military equipment. This means that now all this is being spent. It means that a new type of consumer has appeared with very large demands and priority requests. Yes, it means that a new area of motor fuel consumption has appeared, which did not exist before. It means that it consumes. Secondly, of course, there are attacks on refineries, and this, apparently, has had a significant impact on the capacities of Russian ones. We do not know for sure, the information is classified, but judging by the fact that there are problems and export is banned, as well as by the rise in prices for gasoline and diesel fuel on the exchange, on the wholesale market, it means that Russia is experiencing certain problems with motor fuel. Therefore, such a picture is drawn, and we expect a further increase in the price of gasoline and diesel fuel, because if the attacks continue and the equipment at the refineries fails, it will become more and more difficult to repair it. The equipment is often imported, good equipment was once purchased, and it is difficult to replace it. The Chinese do not give spare parts, they are also on their minds. They say, if you have a broken unit, buy this unit entirely made in China. That is, you could break 1/10 of the part of this unit, but you will need to buy the entire unit. The Chinese do not sell otherwise. Here is the picture for you. And I am not talking about this, read it. There is a speech by Moscow Mayor Sobyanin, who complains very much that China behaves badly, does not give details, sells only the entire technology and the whole unit, and sets double prices. There is no friendship. As the mayor of Moscow said, we found ourselves in a situation of economic war in the East. We thought that there were friends, and there were enemies. We are now at war with them in the East, too. Well, this is the picture. Igor Vladimirovich, and, of course, let's remember about gas, because Gazprom, I remember myself, that 10 years ago, if you watch the Champions League final, Gazprom writes everywhere. Football teams, Gazprom everywhere. This is not the case now. In 2023, for the first time in 25 years, if I am not mistaken, losses in Gazprom, there are $7 billion. And now they are talking about the fact that many European countries have begun to sue Gazprom and there is an amount of $20 billion. How will this affect? What are these claims and will it completely finish off Gazprom? Well, everything is quite complicated there, because on the other hand, as far as I remember, Gazprom is trying to revive supplies to Europe. Look, there are no European sanctions prohibiting gas supplies to Europe. These sanctions seem to be introduced only in 2027. So far, there are some sanctions only for liquefied gas, and there are no sanctions for pipelines. Nobody banned them. It was Russia that cut off supplies to force Europe to abandon its support for Ukraine. And therefore she created a precedent in which she violated the contract for the supply of gas, and now it will be quite difficult for her to fight off in court why she did not supply gas, why she violated her contractual obligations, whether she can punish her. Well, of course, the state budget will find this money for it, but 20 billion is a serious amount. It is almost 2 trillion rubles, at the current exchange rate. This will be a fairly strong blow to the Russian budget, and this is about 1/18 of the budget, not such a small amount of money. So the picture is this, they are now trying to save Gazprom in Russia somehow, but somehow, you know, in a rather specific way. On the one hand, they want to reduce taxes on Gazprom, but on the other hand, they want to take more of Gazprom's profits in the form of dividends. Well, such a strange picture, that is, Gazprom will not receive profit for its own development anyway. What he will receive as a profit for the fact that taxes have been reduced on him will be taken away from him as dividends, since the state is the largest, a shareholder of Gazprom. Well, in general, the picture is that the company as such will be without money anyway, so it is now without money and will continue to be without money. Igor Vladimirovich, I would like to ask you the following. Is there a sector of the economy in Russia that, let's say, is not sick? Well, I'm not for it. Of course, yes, I'm just for everything to die, but there is a place where they can boast, everything is moving perfectly, here is progress, and so let's boast about it. What does progress mean? If there was an increase in production, then yes, it was in the military complex, and then we see that the growth of production stops even in military contrasts. This is also understandable, because they hit a wall, they fully loaded the production capacities that were previously underloaded, they loaded them, but they cannot increase these capacities further, because in order to increase the capacity of the defense complex, it is necessary to build an enterprise. And this is becoming such a difficult thing in Russia, well, because in order to build an enterprise, you must have reserves of resources, yes, which you will then direct to this production. And in Russia, everything has already been picked up, as they say, and in Russia, for example, a rather serious energy crisis has already arisen. Read the speech of Putin's cousin-in-law, Energy Minister Sivilev at Eastern Ekform. He said that we have eaten up absolutely all the reserves of the Soviet Union in the energy sector. Now we need to invest a lot of money to cover the shortage of electricity. And if you have a shortage of electricity, how can you build a new enterprise? You don't have electricity for it, so the situation there is such that in order to build an enterprise, I will have to introduce into the system of rolling blackouts of consumers. Well, this is the picture, because otherwise I simply have nowhere to get electricity from. Therefore, it is impossible to single out any area where there is some kind of steady rise and improvement in the quality of products. Import substitution programs fail quite badly. Little works out with them. Usually this leads to the fact that money is spent, then a certain Russian product appears, and it turns out that it is actually Chinese, only with a re-glued nameplate. Therefore, now Russian electronics have begun to fight to reduce the share of necessary Russian parts in electronics so that it can be considered its own products and participate in tenders. Well, that is, if I previously thought that there should be 30% of Russian electronics, then they will switch it. Let it be 90% Chinese, 10% ours. Let's still assume that this is a Russian product, but it can be bought through a tender for a public service. Well, this is the picture. Therefore, I cannot single out the industry. In agriculture, it is bleak. Non-military industry is in a situation of such a not very cheerful state. There are no workers. It is impossible to buy equipment. So, well, in general, it is almost impossible to find some kind of happiness zone in the Russian economy now. Well, in Moscow, maybe you will find it. You know, if you single out the country of Moscow from the country of Russia, then in Moscow, although it is good, more restaurants have opened in Moscow this year. The Moscow bourgeoisie, which makes good money on the war, walks like a horse in restaurants. More restaurants have opened in Moscow. Well, this is the real picture. Yes, and what is interesting is that this is how they live. Yes, as I understand it, separately from Russia. Is it also a different Russia? Yes, it is. Igor Vladimirovich, I would also like to ask you, for example, the occupation of the Russian economy by China, how difficult is it to become independent again if you want to? How realistic is this, and how long will it take if by chance they want to be full-fledged with a good economy without war? Well, I would say that today it is simply unrealistic. So, look, it means that the Soviet Union once tried to do this, but how did it do it? Conducted with industrialization. Everyone says, oh, Stalin's industrialization, oh, here in the countries it provided for itself, what a beauty. This is said by people who do not know history. Stalin's industrialization was based on the purchase of entire enterprises from Americans and Europeans. European and American projects were developed. A huge number of engineers and skilled workers came to teach the Soviet people how to work with this equipment, and a certain industry appeared, which for some time helped the USSR to live. But it was international cooperation. Today, imagining that someone will actively help Russia develop its own productions so that it can abandon Chinese goods is an unrealistic topic, and Russia itself cannot do anything. It has very weak, very poor mechanical engineering. It has lost a lot of competencies, that is, human capital will be lost. You also need to understand that in order to create your own, you need someone to design it, who organizes technological processes, who teaches workers, and so on. All this is not so simple at all. Now Russia has lost too much and continues to lose. And to solve the problem of becoming an independent power again, fully capable of living without Chinese goods, I think that this is an absolutely unrealistic task. Igor Vladimirovich, the last question. For example, Shoigu was replaced by Belousov in the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation in order to adapt the entire economy to military needs. But on the other hand, I am also trying to understand that in this way Belousov, at the head of the Russian Ministry of Defense, he completely involves the whole of Russia in the war and there is no way back. Well, it's hard to say why it was installed. This is your hypothesis. For example, I have a completely different hypothesis, that it was put in order to stop the large-scale theft of the Ministry of Defense. That is, he was simply appointed as an honest person so that he would stop the crazy theft that was there. Look at how many people have already been arrested from the Ministry of Defense. It's just mass arrests, you can already do. And what, Shoigu is very dear, a very old friend, we will not put him in jail. Well, we'll put him on the side track, let him sit there. And all his closest collaborators, therefore, we, accordingly, will send to prison. Well, this is the picture. Therefore, I think that Belousov's main task was not so ambitious, but simply to somehow limit the scale of theft, so that the money that is now given to the Ministry of Defense, even if it goes to war, they steal for the most part. That's what I think is the main task. As a result, he is not really visible. Belousov, pay attention, time has also passed. What is his function, what he does, what ideas, what projects, he is absolutely not seen, not heard. This is the only way he sometimes comes out of the fog, says something so small, and disappears again in the fog. In general, his function is absolutely invisible neither as Minister of Defense nor as a reformer of Russia's military economy. Absolutely, he is apparently inside, only trying to somehow dirt these Ojeon stables from the remaining ones, and there is nothing else there. In general, nothing can be seen from him, nothing is heard. Belousov is not visible, but Igor Vladimirovich Lipsits is very clearly visible, audible, and thank you very much for this conversation. Igor Vladimirovich, thank you. Take care. With this was Igor Lipsits, Doctor of Economics. Be sure to subscribe, comment, like and share our conversations.